Hello again, welcome to GB News Originals. My guest today is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, retired soldier, former advisor to the White House. Thank you once again for making time for me, Colonel.
Sure, good to be here.
It's been so febrile recently and shows no signs of abating, really. In your opinion, is there hope of peace anywhere in the world right now? Obviously Ukraine, but elsewhere also.
Well, from my vantage point as an American, I see what the president is doing as a sort of extended reality TV show. There's lots of noise and lights, but there's not much substance. And my point is that there are no agreements on the table. There are no teams hammering out agreements that take months to formulate. We just move from one sort of reality TV moment to the next. And so the meeting in Alaska was something designed to boost President Trump here at home, which I think it probably did. People saw it and thought, well, this is wonderful. He's very sensitive to visuals. And then at the same time, he's largely ignoring, even walking away from what's happening in Gaza. He doesn't bring it up. His only comment is, well, they really need to finish this up and get it done as soon as possible, which is a rather frightening thought when you consider it involves the deaths of potentially millions of people. There's no movement forward in any sort of reasonable way for peace and understanding globally. Now, what's really happening on the ground? Well, those are totally different from anything that President Trump talks about. We've got a war brewing again with Iran. Assets are being moved into the region, including theater high altitude air defense missiles and batteries and troops moving into Israel. So it's obvious that we're preparing for something. What it is specifically, who knows? I think it'll probably be some sort of act initiated by Israel to restart the war with Iran. As far as Ukraine is concerned, there's no readiness to sit down and do much of anything on the Western side. So I think President Trump is sort of quietly moving away from it, hoping that it solves itself. Probably will. I think the Russians will end this thing at some point, sooner rather than later. Whether or not they get an agreement with anybody on the European side is open to debate. And the funny thing is, Neil, nobody ever talks to the Poles, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, the Romanians, the people that actually share a border with Ukraine. They're the ones that should be part of any discussion, and no one brings them up. Now we have this new development with Venezuela. We've sent ships down there, 8 vessels, 3 or 4 of which are destroyers, supposedly a force of at least 1,000 or more Marines. Is this saber rattling? Is it a serious attempt to intervene and meddle in the affairs of Venezuela? And we have exaggerated reports of 2 Russian bombers landing in Caracas in Venezuela as evidence for this great threat in the Western Hemisphere now. Nobody points out that we've been threatening everybody in the Eastern Hemisphere for a long time, so one shouldn't be surprised at some sort of response in the Western Hemisphere. So short answer is no. And then at home, I don't see any resolution in the direction of what to do about the sovereign national debt we continue to spend recklessly. Now we have an attempt by the government to take ownership of part of Intel, a large but failing corporation in the high-tech sector. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Why we would do that in a sector that is just flooded with capital and doesn't need any help from the government is beyond me. So it smells bad to me. I'm not sure what it means, but I don't think we should be involved in it as a government. So I don't have any breaking news that would make you or anybody else feel terribly good. But, Americans are just watching the visuals and they're entertained. And that's what politics is about at the moment.
When it comes to Europe, Western Europe, and the leaders specifically, does it seem to you that they have a realistic sense of the peril of the situation in which they find themselves, both in terms of representing their nations, their individual independent nations, and even their personal peril? These are leaders who are so demonstrably unpopular, if not loathed at home. People like the British Prime Minister Starmer with an approval rating of 20%, a similar figure for Emmanuel Macron in France, a similar figure for Merz in Germany. They seem like people who are careering towards a brick wall.
I think they may have already hit the brick wall. It's just that it's not as obvious as it should be at this point, and I'll try to explain my point. First of all, Britain is in serious financial trouble as well as economic problems, and I'm sure you're aware of that. The gilt market almost went under and plunged Britain into what is effectively a depression when Liz Truss was in office. That inevitably is going to happen. So I would say that the leaders that you pointed to are all globalists. They are clinging desperately to power. How do you cling to power? Well, you create this sense of emergency that says Russia is bearing down on us and we may have war at any point in time and we have to prepare for it. I mean, normally these are people that wouldn't spend a dime on defense. Now they want to spend most of the GDP on defense. Why? Without this sense of urgency, without this imaginary Russian boogeyman, they can't stay in power. I mean, what are they supposed to do? Say, well, look, we were wrong about Ukraine. We were wrong in everything we said about Russia. That war is lost and we're in a lot of trouble. They'll be promptly thrown out of office. So they've got to maintain the fiction that there is this great threat in the East for which they have to prepare. That's the first thing. Second thing is they're using, as you know better than I, more and more police power inside their countries to suppress dissent. And they're justifying this on the basis of what they call European values or globalist values, which don't seem to include free speech anymore or free and fair elections. So they're talking in Germany, for instance, of trying to ban the Alternative for Germany, which is rising, dramatically in the polls on the grounds that it's some sort of, radical organization. There's nothing radical about it. It's a joke. These people are, in my judgment, far too moderate. I mean, the emergency in Germany demands much more dramatic action than they're going to get from the AfD. But the AfD has simply said what is obvious to everyone in Western Europe. We have too many people, too many non-Europeans inside our countries. These people did not come to assimilate. They can't be assimilated. They would like to assimilate us. We, Germans, French, British, whatever, are not interested in being assimilated. We have countries. We have an identity. We have a culture. We have religion. We think that most of these people should probably return to the countries from whence they came. Well, that is, of course, a great enemy of the globalists, because the globalists seem absolutely intent on breaking down borders, destroying national identity, national culture. They hate religion, particularly if it's Christianity. They seem to want to erase, Scots, Welsh, Irish, English from the map and call them something else inside this amorphous mass of unfortunate poor people that have been impoverished by years of bad economic management. So, I think that's what you're really dealing with, desperation. They want to stay in power. They'll do anything to stay there. And the more that they press back, the more that they try to suppress dissent, the more they try to shut down free speech, I think the more likely they are to experience an internal rebellion. I don't see how you avoid it, because if these people will not go gracefully into the night, then they'll have to be forcibly removed. Now, maybe if somebody can boot Starmer and get him out, maybe there's hope. I see that Nigel Farage is supposed to announce some sort of plan for deportation of people in Britain, obviously people that are unwanted, and I'm sure that will be greeted as evidence for his Nazi background or some other nonsense, which has nothing to do with it at all. But I don't see how you get past any of this without some decisive action by the people themselves, because their elites are not on their side. The divide between the so-called ruling political class and the population is enormous.
With an eye to history, you don't have to look back beyond a lifetime, to see the way in which the trouble can go right to the top in an instant. What happened to Mussolini towards the end of World War II? What happened to Ceausescu in Romania? It's as though there's a blindness about just how angry people can get, especially when enough people feel they've been backed into a corner where they have nothing left to lose. And I mean, that might sound like hyperbole, but I feel as if the anger is at that kind of pitch across Europe, where, as you say, it becomes a personally existential crisis for some of these individuals.
Well, if you look at someone like Prime Minister Orban in Hungary, who has declined to take in hundreds of thousands of non-Europeans from the Middle East and North Africa. He's declined to accept the dictates of the European Union. He's refused to join in this self-destructive and pointless war with Russia in Ukraine. He's actually doing quite well, and his population is largely satisfied and happy with their lot in life. They feel secure. They don't feel threatened by Russia, and there's no reason why they should. I think the Slovaks have followed his example. Now, in Romania, there was an attempt to elect someone very much like Orban. And it appears that the CIA and probably MI6 and others got involved and made sure that that individual, would never hold office. They couldn't win the election at the ballot box, so they appear to have turned around and depended on the courts to invalidate that particular election. Poland is now beginning to move in different directions. I think this president recognizes the destructive impact of this war on Poland. He's got millions of Ukrainians in his country. They want the Ukrainians to go back to Ukraine. How do you get them to go back? Well, you need change in Ukraine. You have to get rid of the Zelensky government and end the war. I think things are moving in the right direction there. The question is what happens in Great Britain and in France and Germany. The Germans are very, very slow to react politically. I know that strikes people as very odd, but they don't realize that in the 1930s, the government that came to power after a decade plus of total chaos and economic distress. People wanted an end to it. They feared the communists who were in the country, who were doing enormous damage. What is the catalyst in France right now? What is the catalyst in Great Britain for change? I don't know, but I understand what happened in Germany better than most people do. And Merz doesn't seem to have learned anything from that. I mean, the Germans will put up with a lot, and then at some point they say enough. And I think that's coming. I think Macron is very fearful of a French uprising. The question is in Britain, and I don't know the answer. I mean, just removing Starmer isn't going to fix the problem. He's a part of it. But you and I know he's symptomatic of a much larger disease that afflicts the British people right now. I call it their ruling class.
If President Trump holds the line, the apparent line of brokering a peace, where does that leave the EU? Do you see the EU surviving as a bloc, and even NATO surviving as a bloc?
In January of 2022, I was interviewed along with two or three other people by the Institute for the National Interest in Washington, D.C. The man that interviewed us all was Dmitry Simes, a noted Russian expert. And I was asked how I thought things would turn out if the Russians ultimately invaded. And I predicted they absolutely would act in Ukraine out of the need for their own security. And he said, well, what do you think happens as a result of that, the war that breaks out in Ukraine? I said, that will be the end of NATO. So I've been waiting for NATO to collapse now for the last 4 years. I think it's going to go under. It's a race right now between the EU and NATO. Which one goes under first? I mean, the EU is a catastrophe, not because of what it was originally designed to do. If you go back to the origins of the EU, this was really a trade relations entity. People wanted to trade across borders
without market.
Yeah, of course. It made excellent sense. It turned into essentially an authoritarian dictatorship where everyone lost their national sovereignty and everyone was essentially being subjected to involuntary globalization. In other words, the WEF and its adherents seem to have taken over the EU. So I think the EU is on very, very fragile ground right now. And I'm beginning to see a lot of evidence for new regional organizations that could easily emerge in the absence of the EU. I think the same thing is true for NATO. The problem in NATO has always been the same, that once the Soviet Union went away, what was the organizing imperative strategically for NATO? There was none. And I was told at the time when I was serving in the 90s and at the beginning of this century, the Europeans all said, well, NATO has done a good job of maintaining the peace. And then, of course, we got involved with the Kosovo Air War. And all the Europeans looked at me and said, what are we doing? And I said, well, you said this was all about peace. Obviously, the United States and its allies are not about peace. They have a new agenda. And frankly, you can trace the origins of the war in Ukraine all the way back to what we did in the Balkans. Go back and listen not only to what we said in the United States, but listen to Tony Blair, who was offering up at the time 40,000 troops from the British Army to go invade Kosovo, which of course was ridiculous because the British at that point couldn't put 40,000 troops into the field, as my colleagues told me. But he was actively pushing this intervention because they thought, he and the rest of his colleagues in Washington, this was the laboratory for experimentation for the future globalist revolution that would sweep all over Europe. Well, this kind of insanity got us involved in all sorts of things we never wanted to be part of. You know, how did we end up with troops in the Balkans, for God's sakes? Why would we Americans, or for that matter, you British, have any reason to be in the Balkans? There is none. That was always an area of interest to Russia, but never to us. And the Russians liberated those areas from the Muslim Turks. We have no history there. So, you know, the whole thing has been a repudiation of logic and rationality, and we have abandoned the notion that NATO is essentially defensive and protective. No, it's not. It's an offensive instrument of globalism. So I think NATO is on its last legs. It's how do I put it? It's a terminal patient hooked up to the various machines to keep it alive. But as soon as this war ends in Ukraine, and it will end on Russian terms, I think people are going to start disengaging from the terminal patient. People are going to say, we've got to find a new way forward. Because the view of national security in a place like Stockholm or Berlin is radically different from the view of national security in Madrid or Rome. I'm sorry, they're just completely divergent. We just need to accept that fact. So I'm not upset about it, but I think people will argue that, oh, if NATO falls, that's the end of Europe. I'm beginning to think you get rid of NATO and the EU, Europe begins to revive and come back to life.
What do you invoke the Balkans? What do you make of the trouble that is undoubtedly being stoked between, say, Muslims in Bosnia and Catholics in Croatia? Enmities that are being stoked between Serbia and Croatia. There's talk of interference in all of that by British NGOs and goodness knows what else. Complicated by the fact that I understand that even if Europe was to go it alone and face up to Russia, that they have no practical ordnance to offer before 2028, 2029, but that part of seeking to perpetuate the war is to provoke this second front, as it were, in the Balkans, that part of the world that triggered World War One, and has been a simmering point ever since.
Well, setting aside World War One, because people made decisions in 1914 that led to war that in many cases they did not have to make. In other words, we have to understand that people decided to do things that could have otherwise been avoided. So it was not inevitable to have a war on the basis of what happened in Bosnia. Remember that there was one thing or one point on which everyone in the Balkans could agree, and that is that no one wanted a Muslim state on European soil in the Balkans. That was something everybody understood. And I was involved over there almost from the beginning. And I went through what happened in Bosnia-Herzegovina for our purposes, Americans, in 1995, all the way up through the Kosovo Air campaign. Europeans did not want a Muslim state. What did we Americans and British do? Together, we created a Muslim state. No one wants it. No one ever wanted it. And this Muslim state is home to large numbers of people that we deemed enemies of the West. Mujahideen, Osama bin Laden's crowd, they were all heavily engaged there. They were engaged with the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, against the Serbs. And in fact, at the time, many of us felt strongly that we had the opportunity in Tropoja in Albania to attack and destroy Osama bin Laden and his followers who happened to be there at a point in time. And we were collectively told, oh, no, they're on our side. Our side. Well, what does that mean? It didn't make any sense to us, but we went back to work. We had no choice. And we continued to attack the Serbs. Right now, Serbia is in a lot of trouble because they have an extremely corrupt government. And the man at the top of that government has tried repeatedly to sell out Serbian interests. There was on the table just a few months ago a plan to bring 100,000 African workers from Central Africa to Serbia. Well, the population almost went into complete rebellion. So that particular proposal was removed. And of course, Serbs said, why are you bringing in these Africans when we have people here who need jobs? And Serbs don't have enough jobs. Why would you bring in all of these African laborers? I mean, it's all cheap labor. I mean, this is sort of nonsense that goes on. And then we had a number of people that have tried to invest heavily there, actually from the Trump administration, the Kushner family and others. That has been obstructed because people say we don't want to lose control of our country to these foreign investments. There's a lot going on in the Balkans right now that is not good. And the Balkans feel very vulnerable to the West because they see the West now as a menace, pushing this globalism. And indeed, we do. I'm not sure President Trump completely understands it because if this were laid out properly on a table and said, who are the actors and what's going on? And I know President Trump, he would be horrified at the globalist interests, but he doesn't seem to understand that that is deeply embedded in his administration. They keep calling it the deep state. It's not that. It's deep in the sense that there are a lot of people that just don't agree with anything that you and I are discussing, and they want to continue this globalist march. But the notion that it is a mystery who's in it and who's behind it is false. We know who these people are. They're permanent members of the permanent government who are committed globalists, let's be frank. They're supporting all the things that we oppose in the Middle East and elsewhere. So I think Serbia is very vulnerable right now. We'll see what happens next because every time it looks as though Vučić could be removed, Vučić pulls back from his bad policies enough to survive. And you're right, in Croatia, MI6 has been involved. I suspect we are too. We seem to be trying to cultivate or instigate the same kinds of neo-Nazi forces that we've seen in Ukraine, which makes no sense at all. But that's what we're trying to do. And I think it's failing. It's failing because the Croatian people and the Serbs themselves, they don't share this animosity. I mean, I spent some time over there, and I can tell you that war is over, and the Serbs and the Croats don't want to fight it again. And so I don't think this is going to work, but they are actively doing that. And remember that, unfortunately, Bosnia continues to be, much like Kosovo, a repository for a lot of Islamists and Islamist terrorism and a lot of corruption. And they communicate with each other through something called the Sanjak, that is a corridor that runs between Muslim Bosnia into the Albanian area of interest. It's a problem. And if you want to know where the Mexican drug cartels were able to purchase Javelin missiles from Ukraine, well, a lot of it was on the marketplace in Kosovo. And that doesn't even begin to address the drugs that pass through there, as well as the human trafficking. So, again, to go back to one of my earlier assertions, wherever we have meddled, Neil, and I'm talking about the United States and its trusty ally in London, we've created chaos. We've fostered corruption, and we've destroyed the dynamics of the region in favor of bad forces. I want it to stop. I think it eventually will, but not until we're financially broken, frankly. Once we're broke, I think a lot of things will stop.
You know, you've spoken before. I've heard you speak recently in relation to the financial circumstances in which the US finds itself, in which Europe finds itself, I think you've already alluded to the fact that Britain might be in a particularly parlous state on account of people don't see of all the bonds or gilts. People seem to trust the British bonds least. What do you make of talk that the frozen Russian assets, $350 billion worth of assets, divided between Brussels, London, and New York, or wherever, that Trump and Putin may have talked about the possibility of that sum being invested in the US, and that would be a troubling development for the European leaders, who presumably thought, well, if we win this war, there's a piggy bank with $350 billion in it.
Look, it's just theft. It belongs to the Russian state and the Russian people. It should be returned to them. End of discussion. It's not going to fix our problems. The answer to our problems in the West right now, Neil, is for us to quote unquote default. And everyone says, oh, the United States has never defaulted. That's not true. We defaulted twice during the Depression under Franklin Roosevelt. It was called publicly restructuring the debt. And that's exactly what it was. We simply went to our creditors and said, given our current circumstances, our straits, we cannot possibly pay you the interest on our debt. We can't keep it up. We need a restructuring. Well, at the time, remember that the United States had the largest manufacturing base in the world, the largest skilled labor force in the world, and we were swimming in gold. In fact, the British, the French, and others that had fought in the First World War and borrowed heavily from us were paying us in gold. Just think about that. We said, we don't want your currency. You pay us in gold. So we took the gold. Well, all of that helped us enormously in the 1930s. Then, of course, we got the war and we climbed out of the Depression. Today, it's a very different situation. Today, the largest manufacturing base in the world is Chinese. How much gold have we really got? Every time someone tries to find out how much gold there is, they're told, don't you worry about that. We have lots of it. But the Germans have been unable to repatriate all of their gold. The Italians are unable to repatriate all of their gold. So we really don't know what the true gold holdings are in the United States. Our currency at the moment appears to be strong, but it's being debased. So the answer to all of the problems is to admit what you cannot do. We cannot afford over $1 trillion every year in terms of financing our debt. And a slight change upward in the bond market, something approaching 5% in the 10-year bonds, would tank us. We can't cope with it. But all of the globalist governments do not want to admit what I just explained, and they're not going to publicly default. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to steal. They're going to play financial games to conceal the reality as much as possible, and they'll debase the currency. And of course, this is what happened in Germany. And the Germans finally got out of it when they reset the currency. You've got to reset the currency. They just threw out the old currency and started over. And they could not pay all the debts. And they finally said, we're renouncing them because we can't possibly pay them. Well, the Germans came out of the Depression long before we did in the United States. And in fact, even earlier than France and Britain. By the way, Italy came out of the Depression quicker as well. So the only way to get out of this is to admit you're bankrupt. It doesn't work anymore. We should have gone to the Chinese early on under President Trump. I thought this might have happened and said, look, the dollar business isn't working for us. We need to find a way forward. We need to cooperate. The Chinese would have been more than willing to cooperate because, contrary to popular belief, the Chinese do not want to be the reserve currency. They're quite happy to have us remain the reserve currency. They don't want to be stuck with that job, with that problem. But we've taken the opposite track. We've threatened everyone, tried to bully everyone. And what has this done? This has strengthened and expanded BRICS. BRICS is the new financial system that is being designed to replace us, what we have run since World War II. Because if you look at the old British Empire and the financial system set up by the Rothschilds that ultimately took over the Bank of England, we come in 1945 and 46 and 47. Bretton Woods comes in, and what do we become? We become the new British Empire. We inherit all of those requirements and needs. Well, all of those institutions have now failed. We're bankrupt. We're not just bankrupt in the monetary sense. We're bankrupt with ideas. Everything is entropic, if you understand what I mean. We've reached entropy. But nobody wants to admit that, because if you admit that, what happens to all the globalist governments? What would happen to Trump if he came out and said, look, I've looked at everything. We don't have any choice. We've got to restructure. And that means default. We've got to admit what we cannot pay. Oh, well, that's going to be painful. Well, it's better to have a few years of pain than decades of poverty and despair. We've chosen decades of poverty and despair for the future instead of saying, let's take our medicine, let's restructure, let's do what's required, because everybody wants to stay in office.
It's when you put it in those terms, clearly, you talk about the US, that China would be perfectly happy to see the dollar remain the reserve currency, which maintains in some form US credibility. The BRICS bloc, which is looking wherever it came from, whatever it really is, it looks increasingly credible. American sanctions have driven it together, have caused it to crystallize it in a way in which it might not otherwise have done. They're talking about 40% gold, 60% domestic currencies. They're only interested, it seems, in trading with one another. It all looks quite dynamic. My point is, Europe looks redundant, and I felt that the appearance of the Seven Dwarfs, as my friend George Galloway described it, it just underscored the lack of substance of people like Starmer, like Macron, like von der Leyen. It was there for all to see. That what I'm saying is, it feels as though, in amongst everything else, Europe doesn't matter.
Well, I disagree. I think Europe does matter very much. I think it matters on numerous and multiple levels. The problem is that Europe is struggling with all of the problems that we've discussed, plus this enormous debt overhang. And the only way to fix it is to get out from under it. I think Europe's best chance for the future is to become as autonomous and independent as possible from the United States. I think that the United States initially accidentally and then over time deliberately has lulled Europe into a position of almost total dependence, not just on national security, but you've got to look at your financial position. Look at the euro dollar holdings in Europe. In other words, whatever happens in the United States regarding financial ruin and destruction is going to visit Europe. So if I were a European, I would say, let's get together and figure out our own way forward. How do we do that? And the first step in that direction is to end this destructive war with Russia. Russia is not marching west. I mean, the Russians today, especially somebody like Putin, looks at the conditions in Europe and says, who in their right mind wants control of Europe? I mean, would you want to take it over and run it? And no, the Russians aren't interested in that. They want to do business.
But what do these European leaders that we have? What do they have if they don't have the war in Ukraine? Germany's on its knees economically. Britain's been brought to its knees. But post-industrial Britain and all of the rest of it. The insanity of Agenda 2030. That people like Ed Miliband and others are running with full tilt towards another brick wall. What does the European bloc have if that war in Ukraine goes away, when they've staked everything on it?
Well, Neil, you're right, and you're back to the original point that I was trying to make, is that if you're a globalist in power, and that's who's running the show in the countries that we've been discussing, you don't want it to end because it helps you justify or rationalize your position in government. If you admit that there is no threat from Russia and that, in fact, we should be doing business with the Russians, that there's an interest instead of blocking the development of One Belt, One Road, this Chinese essentially transportation infrastructure that runs across Central Asia and connects potentially Rochefort in France with Shanghai in China. If you abandon the attempt to destroy this and instead view this as an opportunity, then I think you have a chance of building an independent future. We're arguing the opposite. We're saying, oh, well, you'll all become dependent on China. And China is another threat. Well, the Chinese have enough trouble governing themselves. There are 1.4 billion Chinese. Every morning, President Xi wakes up and wonders whether or not China is going to hold together for another day. I mean, there is potentially inside China the equivalent of, say, 4 versions of the United States. In other words, China is we should not assume that China as a unitary state remains a unitary state. There are diverse interests in China. I mean, I could go on, but when the Japanese landed in Shanghai in 1937, before they landed, they went ashore and conducted negotiations with the Shanghai banks. And the Shanghai banks cut a deal with them. If you leave us alone and allow us to continue to do business across Asia and internationally without interference, then we won't interfere with you. And so when they came ashore in Shanghai, what happened to the banks? Nothing. In fact, the Japanese never intervened or had anything to do with the banks until late 1942, early 43, when it became clear that things were not going well for Imperial Japan. What I'm trying to tell you is no one in Asia is interested in a war. No one in Europe should be interested in a war. Neither the Russians nor the Chinese want a war with anyone. For that matter, that applies to Iran. If anybody thinks Iran wants a war, they're insane. It's the last thing on their agenda. We are the ones that are fomenting war and conflict and division at a point in the history of this planet when we should have, for the most part, across Eurasia and in the United States and North America, what I would call a productive, prosperous peace. There's no reason.
Plenty.
So, you got to get rid of the globalists. The good news is that they have so badly handled finance and the economies that they will go away. They're just not leaving soon enough. And they've left us with this terrible mess, the economic and financial mess, plus millions of people in our countries that we didn't really invite. See, this is the other problem. When's the last time that anybody held a plebiscite in the United States or Great Britain about immigration? If you held a plebiscite in the United States 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, people would have probably voted, to largely stop immigration, except in specialized cases. We used to have something called the Extraordinary Skills Act, because we shut down immigration in 1924 because we said we were not getting the people we want. Under the Extraordinary Skills Act, we got Albert Einstein. We ultimately got people like Werner von Braun and a lot of others who had an enormously positive impact on us. Now, what I'm saying is you can always have that. You can always bring in people with exceptional skills that are going to productively influence your economic development. But the point is, that's not what we've got right now. And we've got to reset our countries. We've got to reset who and what we are. We need to ask the question, who are we? And answer it honestly. Are we the globalist country that used to be called Great Britain? Or are we British? Are we Scots, Irish, Welsh, and English? And everybody says, well, that doesn't mean anything anymore. Well, the last time I was over there to visit, and it's been a long time since I was in Britain, it still mattered a great deal. I don't think it's meaningless in Europe either. I mean, wherever you go, people still know who and what they are. And unfortunately, when you have large numbers of unwanted people in your society, it awakens what I call the sleeping dog of nationalism. In a healthy society, the nationalism is the dog that doesn't bark. It doesn't have to, because the nation is secure. The core population feels secure. What have we done? We've turned around and made the core population not only feel insecure, we've turned it into an enemy that the government is attacking. What do you expect to happen under those circumstances? Exactly what's happening. That's what Macron and Starmer and Merz and the rest in Western Europe are afraid of. There was just a demonstration in Austria. It said, stop importing, start deporting. That's what they were chanting in Vienna, Austria. The Austrians are not a bunch of wild-eyed revolutionaries. They are absolutely not intolerant people. I've been there and spent many years of my life in and out of Austria. And I'm telling you, for the Austrians to be out in great numbers saying that, it's very bad in Austria. The question is, why? Well, we know why. It was an attempt to target the populations in Europe and effectively destroy them, destroy their national identity and culture. I think people have begun to figure it out. So what have you got running the show today in Austria? We're getting more what they call radical right-wing dictatorships, and that's all nonsense. And it has nothing to do with left or right. People say, wait a minute, I live here. I'm an Austrian. I'm a German. I'm a Dutchman. This is my country. What have you done to me? And I think that question is being asked in Great Britain. And I don't think Starmer has a good answer. Now we'll see how successful Nigel Farage is with his plans if he ultimately ends up in a position of prominence. But I fear that things have gone too far for too long. And it will take more strident and active measures to right the ship. I mean, we're all on a leaky ship right now. It's not enough to plug the holes. You've got to do a lot more to get this ship up straight and running back the way it should be. So I hope he has some success. I just don't know that it's not gone too far already. And that goes back to your question about, I've been listening to this David Betts talk about the potential for civil war in England. Well, I think he's absolutely right. But it all goes back to these issues that we're discussing.
The government, as I see it, ought to be overseeing a nation's immune system, that which keeps the nation healthy. And in this strange, perverse way, the globalist World Economic Forum-driven governments of Western Europe have become an autoimmune disease. They're attacking the people. The immune system that's supposed to keep the people safe and well, on the contrary, is attacking it. And it's you use the reset, and isn't there a great irony that Klaus Schwab and his acolytes in the World Economic Forum trumpeted this notion of a great reset? And ironically, as you say, we do need a reset, but it's the reset that rids us of the ideology of the World Economic Forum, the ideology of the globalists. That reset that they invoked is actually the panacea to deal with the autoimmune disease we have from our governments.
No, that's right. And the reset is coming, whether they like it or not. The question is, how does it proceed? Does it proceed as a result of the ballot box or the cartridge box? And I think the ruling elites in Europe and Great Britain need to ask that question. We need to wake up and understand that every population, you can only humiliate a population for so long. And eventually, no matter how weak it may seem to be, they will stand up and fight. Certainly, we've learned that from all these stupid interventions and wars that we created all over the developing world. I mean, you look at a country like Vietnam, we did terrible things in Vietnam, and we were defeated. Well, how did that happen? Because the Vietnamese, whatever their weaknesses, finally said, this is enough. They wouldn't take it any longer. The same thing is going to happen in Europe. We've got to get to that point. I think that we are beginning to get to that point in the United States, but it's hard to distinguish the reality TV show, which is the Trump administration, from reality on the ground. There are lots of people who see the reality TV shows such as Alaska and say, oh, see, everything's better. Nothing came out of Alaska. Everyone is very happy that President Trump met with President Putin and his team, but there was no result. None. There's no agreement in place, nor is there any work on a future agreement. In fact, it looks like President Trump has now turned away and turned his attention to another reality TV moment. Whether that's in the Middle East or that's in Venezuela, I don't know. But he's very much into optics. It's sort of bread and circuses, as the Romans used to call it. Entertain the population and everything will be just fine. But you can't entertain that way in perpetuity. Eventually, there has to be a substantive outcome. And a lot of Americans have seen what he's done in Washington, D.C. I've been waiting for that to happen for 30, 40 years because the Washington, D.C. is a national disgrace. And I was always embarrassed whenever I would fly back when I was working at NATO and back to the United States from Brussels. And see what the airport was like and the criminality in Washington, D.C. And this is the capital of the supposedly greatest country in the world. So I'm glad he did that. But the problem with that and everything else that happens right now is there's no coherent strategy. In other words, there has to be a strategy behind everything. What are you trying to attain? Well, this week we're in Washington. Great. Then what? In other words, where's your national program? Well, you can't have a national program if you're preparing to potentially make war in the Caribbean against Venezuela. You still have 100,000 men sitting on the border with Ukraine and Europe. How many tens of thousands? We estimate 60,000 plus in all over the Middle East and East Africa. And that may ramp up again as a result of events between Israel and Iran. But he says, no, I solved Iran. The war is over. It's not over. You can't take MI6 and the CIA and meddle in Azerbaijan and meddle in Armenia and then expect the Russians to sit quietly and say nothing because it sits on their borders. You say you want to get along together with President Putin and want to do business, and then you try to destabilize Azerbaijan and use it as a platform for attack against Iran. That's not working out very well. I think Mr. Aliyev, the president there, and basically the country is a place that's just run by mafias. And the Russians have locked up thousands of Azeri mafia members inside their jails and Russia said, no, we're not going to put up with this. I don't think Aliyev will last much longer. He'll be removed because the situation in Azerbaijan is bad. But we went in there with MI6 with the express desire to foment trouble against both Russia and Iran. Because remember, Azerbaijan was the link through which this one belt, one road would go. We don't want that to succeed. Why not? What is this? The world is not a zero-sum game. In other words, if somebody succeeds somewhere, whether it's Iran or Kazakhstan or China, doesn't mean that we're suffering. And this is a mentality that is deeply embedded in Washington, D.C. If it's not what we thought of, if we're not behind it and we don't immediately profit from it, well, then it must be bad and should be stopped. You got to get past all this. The only way to do that is to get rid of the Starmers, the Macrons, the Merzes, and most of what's governing in Washington, D.C. right now, to be frank.
I do like the sound of that, Conor Macgregor. I think that blunt realism is a good note on which to end. You've been very generous with your time, but I fear the reality TV show is just playing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at the moment, and we watch with dismay. But as always, Conor Macgregor, thank you very much.
Sure. God bless everybody in Britain.
Indeed. God bless you too.